We call these unique American artists traveloguers. They are independent filmmakers combining talent, imagination, and hard work to create travel adventure films. Traveloguers have researched the history of their subjects, lived on location for months at a time, and photographed their journeys. After completing each film, traveloguers travel throughout North America with films in hand to share their personal discoveries and insights with thousands of people. The film you are about to see was made by travelogger Frank Nichols. A competent filmmaker, Frank is noted for his creative photography and fine research skills. A graduate engineer who's held numerous management positions, Frank Nichols has a genuine gift for interacting openly with people of all cultural backgrounds and ages. And now, with Frank Nichols as your personal guide and narrator, enjoy this fascinating and ever-changing nation we call romantic Germany.
There is a land of mythic beauty in an old world where storybook castles crown forest-covered peaks, and valleys veiled in mist recall magical days of years long past. Here, music weaves a timeless enchantment for each listening ear, and alpine ridges lie cloaked in layers of majestic winter glades. This is a land of legends, of daring knights and fairy tale kings, a place of fantasy and folklore. This is romantic Germany. For many travelers, Frankfurt is their first window to Germany. Centuries ago, annual trade fairs held here made Frankfurt an important commercial center. But here on the Romer Square, visitors can return to medieval Frankfurt. This is where Johannes Gutenberg set up shop with the very first printing press. His invention changed the face of the world, and Germany's leaders became committed to literacy and education. Germany has produced many world-class poets, philosophers, and composers, and achieved virtually 100% literacy among its people. From Frankfurt, a brief journey down the Main takes you to Rüdesheim on the Rhine River, the heart of the wine country. For more than 2,000 years, the hills along the Rhine have been lovingly cultivated to produce the most succulent grapes for the finest wines. Rüdesheim is a center of the Rhine wine-producing region. Favored by tourists and natives alike for its outstanding wine cellars, the city is also home to some of the most beautiful old houses and half-timbered buildings in Germany. From here, you can take a river steamer down the Rhine, the busiest waterway in all of Europe. More than 10,000 castles and battlement-capped ruins are located in West Germany, and you'll see many of them along the hilltops of the Rhine. In the 13th century, the notorious robber knights of Sonneck Castle developed a passion for exacting high tolls from passing ships, or spilling the blood of their passengers. The Pfalz was built entirely for this purpose. From this island in the middle of the Rhine, robber knights would string heavy chains across the river. 10% of the ship's valuables was the usual levy, A lengthy stay in the castle's dungeons awaited those refusing to pay. After passing the crumbling fortress of Schönberg, the river narrows into a dangerous channel of rapids. At the Lorelei Rock, according to legend, the lonely mermaid Lorelei is said to have lured many river boatmen to destruction with her spellbinding song. Farther down the Rhine, the river widens and the modern complex housing the federal capital at Bonn comes into view. Since 1949, West Germany has been governed by a constitutional democracy seated in this lovely old city. Bonn's most famous son is probably Ludwig van Beethoven. His birthplace and family home is now a museum filled with many of his belongings. Long after becoming deaf in his late 40s, Beethoven continued to compose some of the most magnificent music the world has ever known. Not far down the Rhine is the ancient city of Cologne. When an Italian chemist settled here in the early 1700s, he refocused the world's attention on the city with his famous scented waters called Eau de Cologne. But long before that, the city was a large Roman outpost. During the 1st century, the Romans encircled Cologne with walls. The Roman gate still stands. But Cologne's most noteworthy landmark is the cathedral. Its soaring spires and distinctive flying buttresses are characteristically Gothic. Construction began in 1248 to house the relics and sacred remains of the three Magi in what was to be the largest and most remarkable of Gothic cathedrals. But after 300 years of construction, Gothic architecture had gone out of style, and so had contributions for this colossus. For another 300 years, the cathedral sat unused, overshadowed by unfinished spires. In the 19th century, with the revival of the Gothic style, work started again. By 1880, the extraordinary Cologne Cathedral was finished. Today, the ongoing task of maintenance and repair employs 70 people year-round. Steinau, Alsfeld, and Ziegenhain are three ancient storybook towns. In the half-timbered village of Steinau, two young scholars known as the Brothers Grimm grew up in the heart of fairy tale land. Enchanted with the folklore of the region, they spent their lives collecting stories about cunning witches, playful fairies, vagabond kings, and star-crossed lovers. To its collection of stories, the town of Steinau added another folk tale, a claim to the longest coffee table ever, more than a mile in length, laden with the finest German pastries and cakes. One town the Grimm brothers certainly visited is nearby Alsfeld. Its medieval square with half-timbered buildings has been undisturbed by time. Traveling through this picturesque area, not only were the Grimm brothers delighted with the folklore of the area, but were impressed by its people. In one of their best-known fairy tales, the Grimms built a story around a small girl, a wolf, and a piece of local peasant's clothing. Their famous tale is Little Red Riding Hood. Every year, nearby Ziegenhain hosts a festival where the romantic fairy tales of this region come to life. The story of Little Red Riding Hood is charmingly retold. The distinctive costumes of the region are just as popular today as they were centuries ago. Hamlin, Goslar, and Celle are three other towns with stories to tell. On the banks of the Weser River is Hamlin, or Hamlin as the Germans would call it, the famed village of the Pied Piper. In this enchanted burg, elaborate gables, pyramids, and scrolls became popular building decorations during the 17th century in a style known as Weser Renaissance. One of the most imaginative buildings in this style carries the name of that famous legendary character of Hamlin, the Pied Piper. The Germans called him the Rat Catcher. The legend dates to the year 1248. The town was being overrun by rats. The city fathers, pressured by the townspeople, elected to hire a mysterious stranger to rid the town of the rodents. As legend has it, the village leaders decided to cheat the piper, paying him only a token wage for ridding the town of the rats. In retaliation, the piper exacted a much dearer price for his work. He bewitched the town's children into leaving with him, and none of the youngsters were ever seen again. The quaint village square in Goslar is an exhibit of medieval architecture. Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, and Romanesque designs, they're all here. A brief history of the town is revealed by the clock in the square. Every hour, mechanical figures come alive to portray how silver mining made Goslar a wealthy imperial city in the Middle Ages. The Guild House, built in the 1400s, belonged to an organization of merchants who prospered in foreign trade. Beautiful slate roofs are a common sight in Goslar. An abundant supply of this building material is found in the nearby Harz Mountains. The Imperial Palace in Goslar was once home to the passions and intrigues of 11th and 12th century German emperors. Important decisions affecting all of Europe were made behind these walls. Inside, ornate murals depict early German history. Twice a week, the town square fills with buyers and sellers as the Goslar market gets underway. Local farmers set up colorful booths, offering the best their fields have produced. Goslar is the market center for the Harz Mountain region. In Celle, some of the handsome half-timbered buildings date back to medieval times. Many can be identified by their artistic inscriptions. Some are religious in nature, others offer personal accounts of the families who have owned them. The focal point of Celle is the Ducal Palace, an imposing reminder of former ruling families and their influence upon the town. Celle is known as the gateway to the moors of the Lunenburg Heath. This area is useless for farming, though a special breed of sheep seems to thrive here. Our exploration of Germany continues in Hamburg, Lübeck, and then east to Berlin. Just one glance at Hamburg, or Hamburg, tells you you're not in fairy tale land anymore. Hamburg is one of the great inland ports of Europe and has been a prosperous center of commerce since the Middle Ages. The city is built along a series of canals and narrow waterways that feed off of lovely Alster Lake. Hamburg is a city of gardens, grand hotels, private mansions, and elegant old buildings like the Renaissance Town Hall. For the last 250 years, St. Michael's Church has been the site of a beautiful musical tradition. Every day a chorale is played. Its pleasing melody flows from the church tower. In the shadow of the church tower, these 17th century buildings housed the widows of merchant traders. Today, they house boutiques and art galleries. In the 18th century, wealthy merchant traders built warehouses to process everything from finely crafted clocks and watches to Rhine wines and hearty sausages. Hamburg's warehouse complex is the largest in the world. The vitality of Hamburg's harbor can be experienced by excursion boat. Between 1850 and 1914, many immigrants left Europe from this busy harbor in search for a better life in the New World. Detailed records listing every passenger who sailed from Hamburg during that time are kept in the Museum of History. It's a popular destination for visitors researching family history in the Old World. In contrast to busy Hamburg, the quiet surrounding countryside is a patchwork of small, well-tended farms and thatched-roofed homes. Not far from Hamburg is another prosperous city, Lübeck. In the 13th century, the merchants of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen formed the Hanseatic League. The city gauge dates from that period. The Hanseatic League helped to bring immense wealth to the region. Lübeck can be viewed from the waterway that completely surrounds the city. This 400-year-old warehouse was used to store salt, a product mined in the surrounding area. Lübeck's architecture is noteworthy. The use of stepped gables and brick is unique to this region. Famous for its almond confection, the marzipan, the Niederecker Marzipan Shop is a cozy stopover for visitors. The creation of the marzipan is steeped in medieval legend. According to the story, in 1407, Lübeck was under attack and provisions were sparse. The city's granaries were empty except for sugar and almonds. But the inconvenience of war was not enough to persuade the people of Lübeck to forego their passion for sweets. A reward was offered to anyone who could produce a dessert from the 2 items left in the granaries. On St. Mark's Day, a tasty concoction called the Bread of St. Mark was introduced and thoroughly enjoyed by a grateful city. Just outside Lübeck, the powder-white beaches of the Baltic Sea beckon you to the coastal resorts. Just 20 minutes from Lübeck are the hotels, restaurants, casinos, and splendid beaches of Travemünde. This is the most popular of the Baltic Sea resorts. These huge wicker chairs are a familiar sight here. They're designed with folding doors, offering protection from strong winds and privacy for changing into beachwear. On those days when the Baltic is too cold for swimming, the indoor pool is a popular substitute. The fun really begins when the wave machine is turned on. Visiting the attractive town of Travemünde is a delightful experience. A colorful promenade skirts the beach for 1.5 miles. Sightseers are drawn here to all kinds of diversions. Folk dancing is a favorite pastime in this region. Can catch a ferry at Travemünde that will shuttle them north to the Scandinavian country. Just across the water is East Germany. After World War II, it was divided among the Allies for occupation, and East Germany became part of the Soviet bloc. You must travel through East Germany to get to the city of Berlin. In West Berlin, The most poignant symbol of the war's devastation is the bombed-out tower of the Kaiser Wilhelm Church. This grim reminder of the past is found along one of the city's busiest boulevards, the Kurfürstendamm. West Berlin has a vibrant and at times frenetic pace. It's a center of education, fashion, and culture. Berlin is also Germany's largest industrial city. The Congress Center creates an international flavor within the city. The Victory Column commemorates the success of the Franco-Prussian War, which in 1871 unified the German states into a powerful empire. Berlin became the capital of the new nation, and the Reichstag housed its parliament. Years of political unrest and the burning of the building foreshadowed the rise of Adolf Hitler. Reconstructed, then damaged again during World War II, the Reichstag is today an exhibit hall. In 1961, the much-hated Berlin Wall divided the city. But the citizens of Berlin never lost their emotional ties to one another. On November 9th, 1989, that despised wall began to crumble when the East German government allowed its citizens to pass freely into West Berlin.
I haven't imagined just today in the morning to go over the line. We are doing to Berlin West.
In an unforgettable display of emotion, East and West Berliners greeted each other. Once Berlin's triumphal arch, the Brandenburg Gate had become a symbol of division. But on the eve of 1990, the Brandenburg Gate returned to glory as an emotional expression of Germany's quest for reunification. Back in West Germany, Bamberg, Nuremberg, and Rothenburg are three noble ancient German cities. In the delightful old city of Bamberg, the town hall is built on a bridge that straddles the Regnitz River. The river divides the town into two distinct districts. In earlier days, the left bank was the home of Bamberg's ruling prince-bishops. With strong ties to Rome, Bamberg became a center of political power and trade, as well as a showcase of splendid medieval architecture. Its Romanesque cathedral dominates the bishop's side of town. The adjoining Renaissance building served both as home and administrative center for the bishops. Nearby, Concordia Palace was built in Baroque fashion during the 18th century. Though charming in its own right, life on the right bank did not possess the gilded magnificence of life on the left bank. This was where the common people lived and worked, always under the control of the bishops. The burghers did business primarily in the open pedestrian mall. Merchants still come here to display their crafts and earn their living. Just outside Bamberg is the enormous fortress of Coburg. Built during the troubled times of the Reformation for the Dukes of Coburg, this stronghold had a triple ring of fortifications. Martin Luther took refuge here at one time, and these walls may have inspired his anthem, "A mighty fortress is our God." In Coburg's downtown square, attractive buildings form a backdrop to a statue of Prince Albert. England's Queen Victoria commissioned the sculpture of her consort, who was raised here. Stately Ehrenberg Castle nearby was his boyhood home. But Coburg is best known for its Hummel porcelain figurines made at the Goebel factory. Introduced in the 1930s, the Hummel boys and girls were inspired by the paintings of a nun, Sister Maria Hummel. Germany has a wealth of health resorts and mineral springs, more than 250. Bad Kissingen is one of the loveliest in the land. The mineral waters found here are used to prevent and treat health problems. The elegant spa, with its spectacular gardens, is said to have been a favorite of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, architect of German unification in the late 1800s. Prior to that time, Germany had been a collection of loosely bound feudal states. Bad Kissingen's annual Rakosi Fest celebrates the history of the town and the famous people who have visited the spa in times past. The actor dressed in green is portraying King Ludwig II, builder of most of Germany's fairy tale castles. Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph and his consort are also being brought to life. Many historical figures make an appearance here during the Rakosi Fest. With fortifications that totally surround the old town and castle complex, Nuremberg looks like something from an Arthurian legend. Below the ramparts in the middle of the city is the Hauptmarket. This was a center of economic life in Nuremberg during the Middle Ages. This finely detailed 14th century fountain is symbolic of Nuremberg and its reputation as a center of quality craftsmanship. Guilds established during this period instituted strict ethical work codes. These high standards of excellence became characteristic of fine German craftsmanship, and many have survived to this day. Many streets of the old city are pedestrian malls, which lead to historic sites like Nassau House, a 13th century patrician home. The Holy Ghost Hospital, also from that period, straddles the river. The old Customs Hall was originally a storage facility for grain. Rothenburg is a medieval time capsule. This beautifully preserved city is surrounded by ancient walls, towers, and ramparts. Every year on Whit Sunday, a colorful festival celebrates the Mighty Draft, an act that saved the town from destruction in 1631. The Holy Wars were coming to an end, but Catholics and Protestants were still fighting in this region. As troops prepared to sack the town, the invading commander, General Tilly, offered Mayor Noosh a large tankard of wine. On a bet, the commander agreed to save the city if the mayor could down the entire amount without stopping. Not one to back down from such a challenge, the mayor drained the tankard, saved the city, and promptly went to bed for 3 days. It's also been said that Mayor Noosh lost his taste for wine for nearly a week. The legend of the Mighty Draft became part of Rothenburg's history, and every day in the town square, these mechanical figures retell the story. As we continue our trip through Germany, we'll stop at Regensburg, Schwäbisch Hall, and Munich. Situated on the banks of the Danube River, Regensburg is another town where medieval history lives on. Its sturdy stone bridge is a masterpiece of 12th century engineering. This 14th century gate once marked a boundary of the city wall. St. Peter's Cathedral is one of the most beautiful examples of Gothic architecture in Bavaria. Lying on a trade route that once connected Northern Europe with Italy, Regensburg's merchants were heavily influenced by the much-admired Merchants of Venice. It's not surprising that Venetian-style medieval towers, unusual in Germany, became fashionable palace homes for prosperous merchants who lived here. More modest dwellings, built and rebuilt over the centuries, are the homes of Regensburg's 100,000 residents. Back when the old stone bridge was under construction, workers were fed in a nearby building. Centuries later, on the same foundation, the sausage kitchen continues the tradition. In fact, it is said that those who've not visited the sausage kitchen have not seen Regensburg. Much of German culture is built upon many centuries of folklore. Even the smallest towns have a tradition of incorporating local legend into every celebration, and Neuburg is no exception. During the Old Town Festival, the Hobby Horse Dance tells the story of two brothers who were knights of the realm. Tempers flared when they discovered they shared passion for the same princess. But common sense prevailed before tragedy occurred, and the story has a happy ending. During the Middle Ages, the town of Schwäbisch Hall gained fame and fortune from a precious commodity, salt. The municipal square is evidence of its rich medieval past. An old pillory where prisoners were chained and exposed to ridicule has survived the passing of time. The townspeople developed a boiling process to extract the preservative from the rich salt wells found throughout the area. Every year, a festival commemorates the history of the early salt boilers and the prosperity they brought to Schwäbisch Hall. In a humorous reenactment of a famous event that occurred here in 1376, the salt boilers saved the miller's home and the rest of the town from fire. After being rescued, the miller prepares a huge cake so that the whole town can celebrate. At the edge of the Alps is the thriving city of Munich. From the pedestrian zone known as the Marienplatz, it's obvious that Munich, despite its size, still possesses all of the charm and character of a medieval German village. Dominating the Marienplatz is the Gothic Town Hall. It was turned into rubble during World War II, but has been lovingly and faithfully restored in every detail and at great expense. As early as the 8th century, monks began to settle here, and in the 9th century, a monastery was established. The monks perfected a strong beverage made from roasted and fermented barley that they called beer. They discovered its strengthening and sustaining values when they fasted during Lent and started to refer to the brew as liquid bread. And nowhere does more of that liquid bread flow than during Munich's Oktoberfest celebration. But Munich is much more than a city of beer gardens. It's home to grand palaces like the Residence, the National Theater, one of the finest opera houses in the world, beautiful old buildings and medieval monuments, and elegant gardens, including the largest city park in Europe, the English Garden. The graceful lines of the Chinese pavilion are typical of the international flavor of the grounds. The prevailing architectural influence in Munich is Baroque, and the most exquisite example of this style is found at Nymphenburg Palace. From the latter part of the 17th century, this was the summer home of Bavarian royalty. Lavish French gardens, Baroque baths, marble statues adorn the surrounding grounds. Berchtesgaden, Garmisch, Oberammergau, and Füssen make up one of Germany's most beautiful regions. Nestled high in the German Alps outside of Berchtesgaden is Igelsnest, once a favorite destination of Adolf Hitler. There are no markers or reminders here of that time period. Igelsnest is now the site of a restaurant with a magnificent alpine view. Just below is a mountain spa of Berchtesgaden, one of the most popular resorts in the country. Here, villagers dress in dirndls and lederhosen, and lovely fresco-covered buildings line the town square. Imagine the most breathtaking scenery in the world, and you begin to get a picture of the area around Berchtesgaden. Excursion boats filled with passengers cruise slowly through the crystal clear waters of the Königssee, a narrow natural reservoir. The landscape around the lake is spectacular. If you choose to enjoy it on foot, you'll have an opportunity to see some lovely old buildings, including St. Bartholomew's Chapel. From the boat, a lone trumpeter's chorale echoes longingly across the mountains. Not far away is Chiemsee, one of the largest lakes in Germany. In 1878, King Ludwig II began building the last and most lavish of his three castles here on the island of Herrenchiemsee. Ludwig intended to build a full-scale copy of the Palace of Versailles, but only completed the great central block. The obsessive Ludwig wished to glorify Louis XIV and the principle of absolute monarchy. The beautiful Latona fountain and the incredible Hall of Mirrors were replicas of the French palace. Just to the west in the Wetterstein Mountains is Garmisch-Partenkirchen. In 1936, this captivating community hosted the Winter Olympic Games. Since then, it's become one of Europe's premier ski resorts. The pace here is slow and relaxed. No one in Garmisch ever seems to be in too much of a hurry, least of all the cows. Around 5 o'clock every day, the cows meander through town on their way home from a day in pasture. Traffic slows to a crawl, and people stop to grin at this familiar procession. As everyone knows, Garmisch cows always have the right-of-way. At nearby Eibsee, a cog railway carries visitors through lush alpine forests to the snow-dusted top of the world. From the Zugspitze, Germany's highest pinnacle, a glorious view of the Alps stretches before you. A cross marks the highest point in Germany. In 1633, the Black Death had found its way to the outskirts of the little town of Oberammergau. 1 person in every 10 was dying from the plague. Fearing that their village would be decimated like so many others, the townspeople gathered and made a solemn vow to reenact Christ's suffering if God would save them from the ravages of the epidemic. Miraculously, the town was spared. Since that time, the people of Oberammergau have gratefully carried out their promise every 10 years with their world-famous Passion Play. The village is also known for the beautifully painted frescoes that decorate many of the buildings. This fresco illustrates the skill of the town's wood carvers. For centuries, wood carvers have practiced their art in Oberammergau. Like his father and grandfather before him, Hermann Hasser is a master wood carver. At the age of 13, he was sent to Munich to learn the craft. Now in his 70s, he still takes pride and joy in his lifelong career. In the forested hills that surround Fussen, swirling mist parts to reveal the storybook castles of the Bavarian monarch, Ludwig II. The medieval fortress of Hohenschwangau was his childhood home. In this isolated castle, the young boy became enchanted with tales of frightful dragons and fearless knights. He never lost his passion for fantasy, and because of his eccentric behavior, was often called the Mad King. A horse-drawn carriage ride is a romantic way to approach Neuschwanstein. Ludwig's passion for drama and all things theatrical prompted him to have a theater designer rather than an architect draw the first sketches of his storybook castle. Construction commenced in 1869. Perched high on a rocky plateau of gray granite, Neuschwanstein, even with some unfinished interiors, is endowed with all of the qualities of a beautiful dream. As if Neuschwanstein wasn't grand enough, in 1870, in this nearby setting, Ludwig began building Linderhof. Completed 9 years later, the blended Baroque and Rococo adornment captured the romanticism of the Baroque period. After 17 years of lavish castle building, Ludwig's obsessions depleted his personal fortune and nearly bankrupted Bavaria. In 1886, his family and ministers had him declared mentally incompetent. Under guard, he was taken to Berg, where shortly after, he mysteriously drowned in Starnberger Lake. Ludwig II left a legacy of romantic structures that today draws tourists from all over the world and returns millions of marks each year to the German economy. Lake Constance, Meersburg, the Aargau region, and Baden-Baden are a few more memorable and scenic places to see in Germany. 45 miles long and 9 miles wide in places, Lake Constance is Germany's largest lake and a prime recreational destination. It straddles the borders of Austria, Switzerland, and southwestern Germany. Livestock graze the rolling meadows that surround Lake Constance. This is Germany's dairyland. On the northern shore, medieval Meersburg is regarded as one of the most beautiful towns in Germany. In the summertime, Meersburg is filled with people who like to shop, eat, and climb its steeply ascending streets for a magnificent view of the lake. Wherever you see the friendly Zimmer sign, you'll find an inexpensive bed and breakfast. Just east of Meersburg is the Allgäu mountain region, famous for its cheeses. In a mountaintop shed, Billy Brown prepares his cheese for aging. After about a year, his cheeses are ready to be enjoyed by the many hikers who stop here for refreshment. A visit to the lake would be incomplete without a ferry boat ride to the flower island of Mainau. From April to September, the island is alive with the brilliant hues of thousands of subtropical plants. Overlooking the island is a Baroque palace belonging to Swedish scientist Count Bernadotte. The panorama of the Black Forest is an enchanting one, ever-changing, gradually giving way to rolling pastures. On the northern edge of the Black Forest is Baden-Baden, probably the most famous spa in Europe. The Romans were the first to use these mineral waters for therapeutic purposes, both for bathing and drinking. By the 19th century, this luxurious spa was completed. Since then, Baden-Baden has drawn the wealthy and aristocratic to its lavish hotels and elegant casino. August is the most exciting time of the year to visit Baden-Baden, and horse racing at Effesheim is the main event. Let's continue our travels in Germany with a stop in the university town of Heidelberg, then on to Trier and the Mosel Valley. For centuries, artists, musicians, and poets have had a love affair with Heidelberg, and it's easy to see why. The city sits on a series of charming terraces on the hills that rise above the peaceful Neckar River. Above, Heidelberg's enormous castle rests on Königstuhl Mountain. The vast castle complex was built, destroyed, and rebuilt over a 500-year period. It's a showcase of architectural styles. Within the city, Heidelberg University, the oldest in Germany, is the center of cultural and intellectual pursuits. Founded in 1386, this was the setting for Sigmund Romberg's popular operetta, The Student Prince. In those days, unruly students were locked up in the Studentenkarzer to contemplate the error of their ways, and it would appear to improve their graffiti skills. Today, Heidelberg's student population is an international mix of more than 27,000, or about 1/5 of the city's population. Not far from Heidelberg, the small town of Diedersheim celebrates a time-honored tradition. During the Middle Ages, town officials often allowed farmers to graze animals on adjacent lands in return for a saleable goat of good breeding stock. In modern times, this 500-year-old custom is still observed every spring. The ancient city of Trier is situated where the Mosel River enters Germany. In 15 BC, Roman emperors made Trier their northern capital. Once a fortified gateway, the Black Gate is the largest and best preserved structure of its kind north of the Alps. The imperial baths were begun in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine, but were never finished. His palace was eventually completed and stands watch over the city like a sentinel. Legend tells us that a vision of the cross led Constantine to Christianity. His conversion had a powerful impact on the Roman world and was felt at Trier. By the 4th century, the Catholic Church was firmly established here. This heritage is clearly seen on the market square. This former residence of nobility gives insight into the defensive architecture of the 13th century. With the entrance on the 2nd floor, it was accessible only by a retractable ladder. Municipal buildings on the main square are additional evidence of Trier's wealth resulting from its ties to Rome, but also a result of its location on the Mosel River. Vineyards hug the shoreline on the sunny slopes of the Mosel Valley. The steep, neatly plotted vineyards of Bernkastel are well known for the quality of their grapes. Supposedly, during the Middle Ages, a Prince Bishop of Trier was seriously ill, and nothing seemed to cure him until one of Bernkastel's vintners brought the bishop a bottle of his best wine. Since that time, the medicinal properties of wine have been the stuff of legends. Farther down the Mosel is the charming town of Trauben-Trarbach, which has for centuries based its economy on the area's productive vineyards. Ruins of a huge fortress stand guard over this fertile valley. Trauben-Trarbach is but one of the many towns along the Mosel that's waiting to be discovered. These towns are gateways to this wine-producing region. Many of these vineyards have been owned by the same families for generations. Herr and Frau Troller carefully pruned the vines to allow Aaron's son to better reach the ripening grapes. When fully matured, these grapes will be sent to a local cooperative. Fine Mosel wines are made there and shipped all over the world. Farther downstream, the river has cut deeper, creating high bluffs. As we approach Cochem, an imposing medieval castle offers one more setting for the rich legends and folklore of a real storybook land, romantic Germany.
We hope you thoroughly enjoyed this European travel experience. You can continue your exploration of Europe with other videos from the Travelogue collection as your guide. Each Travelogue video takes you to some of the most beautiful settings in the world. You'll visit many famous landmarks, as well as unique, out-of-the-way places that most tourists rarely discover. Encounter colorful pageantry and cultures that are vastly different from our own. You may even uncover your own heritage. One thing is certain, an excursion through the entire Travelogue collection will greatly increase your understanding and appreciation of the world in which you live. To start or build your own Travelogue library, call our toll-free number today. We call these unique American artists traveloguers. They are independent filmmakers, combining talent, imagination, and hard work to create travel adventure films. Traveloguers have researched the history of their subjects, lived on location for months at a time, and photographed their journeys. After completing each film, traveloguers travel throughout North America with films in hand to share their personal discoveries and insights with thousands of people. The film you're about to see was made by traveloguer Kenneth Richter. After attending Harvard, he learned film production as a camera crew member for several major Hollywood film studios. Since then, he has worked in more than 80 countries on educational, commercial, and travel films. In addition to lecturing and producing films, Richter designs and manufactures photographic equipment. In fact, in 1985, he won an Academy Award for one of his innovative designs. Now let's join Ken Richter as he guides us on his tour of the beautiful Rhineland in A Portrait of Germany.
When the Romans came, they brought culture to Germany about 2,000 years ago. They moved up the Mosel Valley, and here at a place they called Augusta Trevorum, they built this stadium, like the Colosseum in Rome, arranged so they could flood it and stage naval battles with gladiators fighting each other to the death for the entertainment of 20,000 screaming, bloodthirsty spectators. And when the Romans came and established their capital of Rome beyond the Alps, at a place today known as Trier, they realized they were moving amid a batch of unwashed citizens, and so they built a set of Roman baths. And these Roman baths were so well built by an honest contractor, they're still in pretty good shape today. When the Romans came, they realized that the unwashed citizens were not likely to be terribly cordial, so they had to build a set of walls surrounding their city of Augusta Trevorum. And this Porta Nigra, the Black Gate, was perfectly constructed and still stands today, spanning the piece of Roman highway that came all the way as a paved road from Rome. There were 40,000 miles of paved Roman highways. This was part of the secret of maintaining the Roman Empire, because troops could march quickly over these paved highways to put down dissident tribes in far areas. The Emperor Constantine built this throne room, which later became the Basilica of the city of Trier. And eventually the archbishops since there was no such thing as separation of church and state in the Germany of the time, had a pipeline to the public purse and spent it rather elegantly on places like the Archbishop's Palace. From the sculpture here, we can determine some of the Archbishop's interests. Some of the wealthy citizens of Trier built stately homes along the main streets. Wealthy landowners, prosperous merchants, and part of the prosperity of latter-day Trier came from the fact that they had obtained the privilege of holding a market right here in the square where the pavement was laid by the Romans. That market cross was installed in 920 and still gives Trier the privilege of holding a market. The flavor of Roman times is still to be sensed here in Trier with the Porta Nigra at the far end of the marketplace, and the fact that surrounding the city, the hills are covered with grapevines. The Romans imported the vine to this part of Germany. What we're going to be looking at is the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. And it was here in West Germany where we see the Mosel Valley and the city of Trier, and just north of it is another Roman town called Aachen, known in Frankish times as Aix-la-Chapelle, and the Roman bath there is in beautiful condition. The Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, of whom this little statuette was recently discovered, it's now a treasure of the Louvre in France, attempted to re-establish the Roman Empire with himself as chief. He built a splendid city here at Aix-la-Chapelle with a marvelous cathedral and a palace. But even Charlemagne found it necessary to fortify his town hall. His main problem was communication. The Roman highway system that enabled the kings of old to send troops out to put down dissident tribes had crumbled, and so Charlemagne wasn't able to maintain the order in his empire that he hoped for. Eventually, after Charlemagne's demise, the archbishops of Cologne, Mainz, and Trier got together with the Count Palatine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia to elect one of their members, the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, if the truth were told, he was not particularly holy, nor was he Roman, and even his title as emperor was frequently subject to challenge by such as the citizens of Lübeck in the north. They felt no need for central authority. They had their own defenses, including the marvelous Holstein Gate around the city. In fact, up over the walls of the city, you'll see this signet that says SPQL, Senatus Populusque Lübeckensis. The Senate and the people of Lübeck are sovereign here. No emperor need apply. Well, in fact, the ordinary people of Lübeck had no voice in their government. This was in the hands of the patricians, the wealthy merchants, and the guildsmen. The city of Lübeck became the center of the Hanseatic League. Lübeck prospered as the center of the Hanseatic League and spent some of the revenue from it to build their splendid town hall with its magnificent staircase. And all over town, you'll see the little spires of Lübeck, which gave the city a profile which became famed all over Europe. Every last one of these spires was knocked down in World War II. Every last one of them has been meticulously and lovingly rebuilt. If you work in Germany, and in the afternoon you begin to feel a little feeble, you can always jack up your blood sugar because every town provides that marvelous amenity called a Café Konditorei. I have to warn you, however, that in restoring your blood sugar, you may find yourself subject to the fact that a piece of Schokolade-Torte like this contains only 5,000 calories, and that's before they put on the whipped cream. The towers of the Lübeck Cathedral were knocked down in the war. Those too were replaced, and the city has regained much of the external appearances that it had before the war. But the elegant detail that took centuries to accumulate has largely evaded restoration up till this time. Stroll along the side streets of Lübeck. They'll all eventually bring you back to the main street where you'll see the Shipwrights Guild House. The Shipwrights Guild was one of the rulers of the town. It was the guild's people, the patricians and the merchants who held the power. The ordinary people had no vote. The idea of democracy had been dead for hundreds of years when the structure was erected. At the north end of town is the splendid North Gate. Again, just about 6 feet tall at the end of the war, but rebuilt largely with Polish workmen. In the process of rebuilding the city of Gdansk, which we used to know as Danzig, the Poles rediscovered the technique of making salt-glazed brick. So a team of Polish workmen was invited to Lübeck to rebuild the North Gate and did a splendid job. Through the North Gate, you go down along the Trave River to the mouth of the Trave, a town appropriately named Travemünde. And here at Travemünde, you'll see the Passat, the German sailing ship. Now, if you sail your boat up the Trave River from Travemünde to Lübeck, be a little careful, because much of the east bank of the Trave River is the frontier of the People's Democratic Republic of Germany, or East Germany. And if you make an inadvertent landing there, you may have a little difficulty explaining to your wife why you're 6 months late getting home for dinner. Stroll along the waterfront on a Sunday afternoon in Travemünde. Look at all the people with lots of smiles. Smiles are a much rarer commodity over in East Bloc countries. Lübeck made its fortune by being the outlet for French and German wines to the Baltic countries. The wine from Germany came from the Mosel Valley, and the central town there is Bernkastel, which has this enchanting main square. Houses done in a style of half timbering, reflecting the timber shortage of the Middle Ages, one of the energy crises of which we hear very little in our history books, but they didn't have enough wood to make buildings entirely of wood, so they made them of half wood, half timbering, called Fachwerk. And nowadays they make new fake Fachwerk buildings in the same style. In the companion town of Kues lives a friend of ours named Bernd Wendhut. Bernd is a sculptor. He is carving the base of a fountain to be installed in one of the Mosel towns. German municipal authorities have differing priorities from our own. We tend to think that, well, this year's budget and maybe next year's budget is all we can think of for the future. But in Germany, they think that perhaps 100 years down the line, the population of this small town will enjoy Wendhut's work, which shows the production, the transport, and the enjoyment of the local product. One of the most pleasant things to do in Germany is to take a boat along the Mosel. You can plan your excursion to leave Bernkastel in the morning, go down to Beilstein, and return to your same hotel in Bernkastel the same evening. It's a low-key journey. It's not like the one along the Rhine where every hill is castle-topped. But here, everything is vineyards, vineyards everywhere. In the background, you'll see one of the heavily laden barges that carry bulk cargo up and down the Mosel, which has been made into a navigable river by a joint operation of the Germans and the French, who've placed 10 dams and sets of locks here. When the Romans came up the river, they dragged their barges with mule power, propelled principally by profanity. Every one of these towns gives its name to the vintage produced in the vineyards in the hills behind. Traben, Trabach. If you own 6 acres of vineyard, it's a good living for you and your family. If you own less than that, it's a good part-time job. But should you be fortunate enough to own 10 acres of the famed Doktorberg behind the town of Bernkastel, your future and that of your grandchildren is virtually guaranteed. We're going to stop at the town of Zell, which gives its name to the Zeller Schwarzkatz, the black cat Mosel wine, produced in enormous quantity on the hills behind the town of Zell. For a long time, this was all handwork. But handwork in Germany has become more expensive than in most places in the world, so they've moved huge earth-moving machinery to smooth out the hillside, so much of the work formerly done by hand can be done by machine. One of the fun things to do when you come to Zell is to stop in the hotel, which was once the castle of the man who owned all this. All modern conveniences have been most ingeniously tucked into the turrets and spiral staircases, and it's a real delight. And perhaps you'll want to spend a day in Zell and go out and watch German workmen on holiday, enjoying an intellectual game. But Germans respect intellectual accomplishment. A master's or doctor's degree is the union card of the learned trades in Germany. German workmen are very well paid, and their social benefits cost about $2,000 per year per taxpayer. The burden of social benefits for German workmen is causing the same kind of budgetary problems that we're finding in the United States, and they're not going to be any more easily solved. In Germany today, even the intellectually elite have come to agree that the chaos of a true democracy works better than a tightly guided society. They've seen the alternatives in their own history, and need only look east to see what's happened to Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland. But we'll leave our friends to solve this unplanned checkmate and head back aboard the boat to continue our trip down the river. Many prosperous German families have second homes these days. They call them Ferienwohnungen. They build their little houses either in the Black Forest or up on the North Shore, or here in the Mosel Valley. They may buy a 10-meter square piece of vineyard and build their house right in the middle of a vineyard so they can reach out the windows and harvest the product. When we first went to the Mosel Valley, there were just a few vineyards, relics from earlier times and from the first Roman plantings. Today, they're replacing many of the older, lower-yielding vines with new high-yield strains. Any place they can convince a grapevine to grow, even to hang by its toenails from a cliff, like here, you'll see vineyards along the Mosel Valley. We saw the remains of a nunnery. We were told that this is where the daughters of noblemen used to go to be nuns. But very few daughters of noblemen want to be nuns these days, so this place has been declared surplus and is now principally a vineyard. Eventually, we come down to Beilstein, the seat of Count Metternich, the man who helped to redraw the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. The boat turns around at Beilstein. I've often wondered how the Germans can sell Mosel wine in California cheaper than the Californians can sell their own product, especially in view of the fact that German labor costs are higher than California costs. To find the answer to this, we went up the river to the town of Kues, where there's a huge wine cooperative. Not like the old-fashioned cellars of the Mosel, this is about as glamorous and romantic as a Pepsi-Cola bottling plant. Wine was invented because people mistrusted the water, which tended to be polluted. So all over the world now, we find that people mistrust water for drinking. And this is a substitute for water, enthusiastically adopted by the Germans, and now they ship this water substitute to places where people simply don't trust the water. Another water substitute, produced in even greater quantity, is the product of the town of Einbeck. At one point, the town of Einbeck had 1,100 breweries in the one small town. Every house in town was a brewery. The attic was full of malt and hops and barley. The Bock beer of Einbeck went all over Europe and made the town famous and brought them enormous prosperity. Look at the elegant hardware on these windows of this early Einbeck office building. And the rest of the building could be decorated any way that you had the money to pay for. Here in Einbeck, the Raben family had as their signet something which they say was later adopted by someone who came from Austria and led Germany to the darkest period in her history. There's only one brewery left in Einbeck today. It's the Municipal Brewery, and it looks rather quaint seen from the outside and seen in the courtyard, but the equipment is the very latest that you'll find in any brewery in the world. Not copper kettles, no, these are the latest and most expensive stainless steel vats, and there's not a human being in sight. It's all operated by computer control. It's totally automated. If you go to the archives in the Municipal Brewery at Einbeck, there in the archives they have the original of the bill that was supplied to Martin Luther for the beer furnished for his wedding ceremony. Luther was quite a guy. He never would have gotten away with pinning his theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral had he not had the backing of Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Together, these two men dared defy a pope who maintained the largest army and navy in the world. Würzburg was nearly flattened in the war, but everything has been rebuilt in the early style, including the cathedral, which was heavily damaged. When you drive into Würzburg, you drive over a bridge, the Heiligenbrücke, which was built in Roman times. Beyond the cathedral is the Archbishop's Palace, where we saw these ladies in costume, the only costume ladies we saw in all of Germany. In the background is the Archbishop's Palace, designed by Balthasar Neumann, a remarkable architect, contractor, finagler, and quite a genius in his own way. He had the backing of a very powerful personality, the Archbishop of Würzburg, and he spent 21 years building this palace for the Archbishop. It has some marvelous details, like the main staircase. How would you like to have a staircase like this in your house? The ceiling is famous. It's done by Tiepolo. It's almost the size of a football field. Tiepolo signed the work with his own portrait in the corner. He also included a portrait of his collaborator, the mad Italian sculptor Antonio Bossi. This is in the Kaisersaal, the room where the Archbishop received the king. I'm sure the king must have looked around himself and he said to himself, I wonder how a mere archbishop can afford a pad as fancy as this when I, the king, cannot. In the ceiling here are more frescoes by Tiepolo, this one showing the wedding of Frederick Barbarossa with Beatrix, the Princess of Burgundy. Ordinarily, in time past, you had to be a rather important citizen to receive an invitation from the Archbishop to visit the palace and the gardens. But today, since this place is supported by the citizens of Würzburg, they're free to come and go, and so are you. You can enjoy the Archbishop's taste in gardens, also his taste in sculpture. They change the plantings in the garden about 4 times a year. Here they're planting pansies, which will flourish through the wintertime. The climate in Würzburg is moderated by the Gulf Stream, and Germany's climate in general is a good deal more moderate than much of the United States. I'm not sure if you like the Baroque style in architecture, but the litmus of whether you do or not you will find in the chapel built by Balthasar Neumann for Archbishop Schönborn. Some people say that this is a preview of heaven, but for certain this will tell you whether or not you go for Baroque. Obviously, it took a lot of skill, a lot of money to build this thing, and so Archbishop Schönborn had to be rather careful to keep the cash flowing. He was determined to keep the money coming to build that splendid palace, and it is said that his debtors' dungeons were commodious. But he did leave a splendid monument in collaboration with Balthasar Neumann and a splendid city of Würzburg at the head of the romantic road, the Romantische Straße. Würzburg began as a castle overlooking the River Main, which after the crumbling of the Roman highway system was about the only way to get goods from one point to another. They had to travel on the rivers. So if you owned a castle that commanded a river passage, you could exact tolls. The castle today is a museum featuring the works of the great Tilman Riemenschneider, whose portrait of St. Kilian, the Irish Billy Graham of his time, brought religious revival to Central Europe. He also did portraits of other saints in sandstone, and his most famous work is his Adam and Eve, placed for morality purposes on opposite sides of the museum. Among his well-known works, too, is the altar at Kreglingen. This was done in the time before literacy was common, so the only way to get an idea out of one mind and into another was either through the spoken word, which was limited, or through illustration. So the sculptors, the painters, the mosaic makers became the hotshot communicators of their time. Riemenschneider prospered and even signed the work with his own portrait, which you can see in the lower right-hand side. He became an alderman of the city of Würzburg and is well remembered for the splendor of his works. We'll continue down along the romantic road to the classic wall town of Rothenburg above the Tauber River, then on to the classic wall town of Dinkelsbühl, then to accept the invitation of Baron von Tucher for a candlelight concert in his castle at Leitheim. Take a little while to see Rothenburg. Stroll up the main street to the main square, where at noontime a rather charming bit of Rothenburg history is recreated by puppets in the face of the town hall. It seems that the Catholic armies under General Tilly were besieging the Protestant city of Rothenburg. General Tilly came into town under a flag of truce, said, if there's anybody here in town that can drink more beer than I can without drawing a breath, I'll withdraw my armies. So the mayor of Rothenburg, who'd had long practice in this old German indoor sport, took him up on the challenge and drained a 5-quart tankard without drawing a breath. It killed him, but he won the freedom of the city. Stroll around the ramparts surrounding Rothenburg. But if there are too many tour coaches in the parking lot, go down to Dinkelsbühl. This town is off the beaten path. Its ramparts recall the lawless times of the Dark Ages, when every man's hand was against every other's. There was no central authority. Your only defense lay in powerfully built walls like that. The portcullis kept down, only raised when it was thought that it was safe to let you into town. Today, Dinkelsbühl receives everybody, including us, and visitors from the far corners of the world. who put up in a marvelous hotel across the way, a hotel dating back to 50 years before the time when Columbus came looking for us. Get lost in Dinklesview. It is not difficult and it is not dangerous because it's only a 20-minute stroll from one side of town to the other. Enjoy the window boxes full of geraniums and the lovely hardware in the doors. Go under this archway into a courtyard. At the far end of the courtyard, you find an alleyway. The alleyway takes you down to a square adjacent to the East Gate. And in the square, in front of the East Gate, you'll see a grocery store. Looking in here, you see the extraordinary quality of things that Germans can pay for now. They're prosperous, and they have achieved a standard of living that they haven't known for a very long time. And like ourselves, they'd be reluctant to find this diminished even slightly. The purpose of these walls and gates that you see in many German towns was very simple. This was your life insurance, the only guarantee that you could have in those difficult times, that you could wake up in the morning without having been murdered in your bed by brigand bands who acknowledged no authority and could loot and steal as they chose. The cathedral is the largest building in town. It's at the end of the main street. At the other end of the main street is another large building, which is a youth hostel. You can overnight there for about $1 if you're a student. We overnighted at Castle Harburg, which has a hotel with 8 rooms. They raised the drawbridge at 10 o'clock so nobody can bother you. Here they told us about Castle Leitheim, built by the Archbishop of Donauwörth as his summer place. On weekend evenings in summer, Baron von Tuke, who now owns the place, lights up 400 candles in the music room on the top floor. He invites a string quartet in from Munich to play some of the same music that was played here when Mozart played in this very same room. He invites guests in for the evening, and it's marvelous. At one time, you had to be a person of great importance to be invited here for one of these charming evenings. But today, Baron von Tuke, who enjoys chamber music, really can't afford to bring a string quartet out from Munich, so he's democratized the enjoyment of such an evening. He sells tickets. But I can't think of any more romantic experience in all of the traveler's world than a candlelight concert at Castle Leitheim overlooking the Danube in the Archbishop's summer palace. By all means, if you're anywhere near it, plan to do this on a Friday, a Saturday, or Sunday evening in the summer. Now let's continue on down the romantic road to Augsburg, where our friend Dr. Hannelore Müller is cleaning a reliquary. She has this in the Gold and Silver Museum in Augsburg, of which she is the director. Dr. Müller said that not only were the wealthy making gifts to the church, but the ordinary people, for whom the church was the only thing of beauty in their dismal lives in the Middle Ages, would often save pennies so that a sculptor could produce something of beauty to ornament their beloved church. And obviously the gold and silver work of Augsburg brought it a reputation far beyond the borders of its little province. The Maximilianstrasse is the central street of Augsburg, and in the middle of it is the Hercules Fountain. Not exactly a piece of pacifist propaganda, because somebody's having his brains bashed in here. So why is this the spot to which newlyweds always come to have their first pictures made in a life of wedded bliss under this symbol of eternal strife? These young Germans today are facing the continuing burdens of reconstruction after the war. Augsburg itself had very few buildings more than 6 feet tall when the war was over. And the palace that contains the gold and silver collection was a ruin, now restored. The town hall, built by Elias Hull, was just a pile of broken brick. but it's been restored using the original drawings. Augsburg made its fortune from not only the gold and silver trade, but also from the fact that it was the hometown of two of the wealthiest banking families in history, the Welsers and the Fuggers. The Fugger banking empire was so large they had to build a restaurant for their employees. Jacob Fugger the Rich was so rich that he bought the crown of the Holy Roman Empire for his client, the Emperor Charles V of Austria. And Jacob Fugger here was able to say, without me, Your Highness, you would not wear that crown. But he was also a philanthropist and built the very first retirement home in history for the retired employees of the Fugger banking empire. It's called the Fuggerei, and it's about a quarter of a mile east of downtown Augsburg. So this is the oldest retirement home in the world, the leisure world of its time, and the endowment that funded it was bought in the 16th century. I wonder what kind of stocks they invested in. I'd like to know. You continue down the Maximilianstrasse to the south now, going toward the mountains. And in those mountains in early days, there used to be all sorts of strange creatures, gnomes and elves, and they're still there. Looks crazy. And so does this to me. This guy is trusting his neck to an old bed sheet and a few pieces of baling wire, jumping right off the top of a mountain. Did you ever wonder what it would be like to do this sort of thing? Well, let's do it. A very special kind of euphoria comes over you as, in the nearly total silence, you can hear from half a mile below the bark of a dog, the crow of a cock. Crazy, maybe? But who was crazier, the guy flying those kites or the guy who built the castle next door? There was nothing wrong with King Ludwig. He just liked to build castles. But when a king wants to build 21 castles, something's out of balance. It was the state treasury of Bavaria. He ruined the country. But now they're getting their money back. They charge admission to the castles. They take in $250,000 a day. So park your car at the foot of Neuschwanstein Castle and stroll up the pathway that leads beyond, up into the woods. Relax on a bench and look at the fall colors and realize you've come to the end of the romantic road. Heidelberg, above the Neckar River. Heidelberg, with a castle once owned by a lady who married the brother of the King of France. And when she died, he thought he owned this place. He came to try to claim it. The locals thought he shouldn't have it. There was a big argument. He finally settled it by trashing the place. But he couldn't afford enough gunpowder to destroy all of Castle Heidelberg, so the ruins have stood and been gradually restored over the centuries. When you go into Castle Heidelberg, you'll find a virtual library of architectural styles, all the way from the Roman through the Gothic to Renaissance. It's become an outdoor classroom for architecture students. Stroll along the ramparts. Look down to the town, from which the Duke could look and see the cathedral operated by his friend the Archbishop. And eventually the Archbishop convinced the Duke to build an expensive religious statue on the main square. People buy souvenirs here. They have all kinds of souvenirs for every kind of taste. One of the suitable souvenirs of Heidelberg is a Black Forest cuckoo clock. They're ready for customers from all over the world here on the main street of Heidelberg, which is a pedestrian zone, no motor vehicles allowed. Heidelberg is a university town with the old library. The university used to be in the downtown area, but they've moved out of town. But the old library remains, giving a bit of the flavor of the time of the student prince. The new university campus is about 2 miles northwest of the center of town, built at great expense by hard-working German businessmen and workers. We had the pleasure of visiting with Professor Dr. Hans Specht. When I learned he was a professor of physics at Heidelberg, I said, "I'd like to photograph you at work." He said, "I'd be delighted to have you." The student body is the pick of the intellectually elite from all over the world. And in fact, less than 1 student in 10 who applies to Heidelberg is accepted for admission. Professor Dr. Specht knows that among the 400 brilliant young people in this physics class, almost certainly there's no Nobel Prize winner. One of these young people will discover how to enclose an atomic plasma in a laser or magnetic bottle and thus free us forever from dependence upon fossil fuels. Then we went with Professor Dr. Specht to the Max Planck Institute in the hills beyond the city of Heidelberg. In this rather unprepossessing looking structure, they have one of the highest energy magnetic particle accelerators in the world. The future of the world's energy use may be right in this room. It's all in charge of a lady professor doctor. What do you do in an evening when you're in Heidelberg? You do the same as students do here. You go to a student locale and try to capture a bit of the flavor of the time of the student prince. Students here talk a lot of politics without the fear of the microphone underneath the table with the wire leading off to the government tape recorder, as we have seen frequently in East Bloc countries. The water substitute is served here in simply staggering quantities. Speaking of romantic Germany, what could be more romantic than a trip down the valley of the Rhine? I like to start in Bacharach, because in Bacharach they have the very best Café Konditorei in the entire Rhine Valley. The Pfalz was once owned by a robber baron who sent his armed servants out to string a chain across the river. So when you got hung up on the chain, you had to pay 10% of what you were carrying to the robber baron in exchange for the privilege of continuing on down the river. And if you didn't pay, the dungeons in the Pfalz were commodious, damp, and full of rats. The trouble was, just down the river, there was another one of these robber barons that was quite a lot like April 15th. Now we come to the area of the Lorelei legend. I'm sure you know the story of the Lorelei girls, those gorgeous blondes who sat on the sharp rocks at the base of the great Lorelei cliff, combing their long golden hair and wearing big smiles and nothing else. And the early Rhine sailors were so spooked they lost all control of themselves, ran their boats on the rocks and were drowned. Get aboard the hydrofoil. This will give you the entire romantic Rhine experience in the same length of time it takes to do it by train, 45 minutes. But to be perfectly honest, I like my romance at a slightly lower velocity. So I'd much prefer to take one of the Schlappers, the lovely old paddle wheel steamers, as they make their way up and down the river. More bulk cargo travels on the Rhine than by any other means of transport, all the way from Rotterdam up to Basel in Switzerland. And so we come on down to the town of Boppard. Below Boppard is Castle Marksburg, the best preserved of all the castles on the Rhine. The original torture chambers are still in the castle, with all the equipment still in good working order. Then underneath the Autobahn Bridge, we come toward Koblenz, with the great castle, the fortress of Ehrenbreitstein, beginning to appear. This is not one of your romantic castles. This was built in the early 19th century, and it's full of embrasures and gun ports. Most people terminate their Rhine journey at Koblenz, but we're going to stay with the boat and continue on down to Bonn, the capital of the Federal Republic of Germany. I think you like Bonn. As federal capitals go, Bonn is rather low-key, rather leisurely paced, in fact, very laid back, relaxed. They've built a new federal capitol building in which they pile one bureaucrat on top of another, a technique we've learned quite a bit about ourselves. The university at Bonn is housed in the former Archbishop's Palace. Those archbishops built better than they knew for purposes they could not possibly have imagined. You will also like Bonn because it reminds you of Beethoven. This was his hometown. His statue's out in front of the post office, that yellow building in the background. Beethoven, you recall, grew increasingly deaf as he got older. Pretty painful for a musician. There was a young man here trying to capture some of Beethoven's immortality, and this kid slips. He'll get his immortality a little quicker than he expects. The whole object of the game was so the buddy could make a photograph of him. The town hall at the end of the square is a lovely Baroque building overlooking the marketplace. Bonn has the market privilege and exercises it every day. But nowadays the prices are all fixed. It spoils a good part of the fun. I'll give you a little tip if you're traveling in Germany and you're invited to a German home. An always appropriate gift for your hostess is a bouquet of flowers. And you can buy them in the open market for a half to 1/3 what they'd cost in a flower shop along the main street. They'll be of the same quality, and they're always very acceptable. And then you want to leave Bonn and head on down the Rhine in the direction of another of our favorite cities, the city of Cologne. I'm particularly fascinated by that cathedral that was designed in the year 1260 and completed 600 years later. Out in front of the cathedral, we saw these young men with strange hats, learned they were recruits just released from military service. What you do when you get out of the army, you put on one of these crazy hats, take on all the water substitutes you can handle, and forget for a moment that yours was the body that was on the front line between East and West, because that's where Germany sits right now. From Bonn, we're going to go northward, into the wind-swept plains of North Germany, up in the direction of Bremen. Bremen has a marvelous town hall. In front is a statue of the legendary knight Roland, who felt it his duty to establish the orders of chivalry, to protect the poor and the weak against the proud and the arrogant. And I'm sure he had his uncle Charlemagne in mind when he established those criteria. It's always surprised me to think how rapidly architectural styles crisscrossed Europe even after the breakdown of the Roman highway system made communications difficult. If you've been in Venice and you've seen the Palace of the Doges on the Piazza San Marco, you'll realize how very much like the loggia on the Palace of the Doges is in comparison to the loggia on the west face of the Bremen Town Hall. It's a direct copy. The harbor of Bremen is one of the most important in Europe. This was a ship from Barranquilla, Colombia, unloading a cargo of Colombian gold. Not what some people think. This is coffee. Germans have always insisted on having the very best coffee and are willing to pay for it, so don't be surprised to get a bill for $1.50 for a cup of coffee in a German restaurant, and the same price for a refill. In exchange for these gold-plated coffee beans from Colombia, they ship the Colombians brewing equipment made in Germany. The export trade in Germany is remarkable. They send things like cloth-making machinery to the People's Republic of China and spaghetti manufacturing equipment to Italy, and huge 1-meter diameter oil pipeline pipes, miles of it, headed for Saudi Arabia. In the harbor of Bremen, we counted the flags of 26 different seafaring nations. For a long time, Bremen was the broker between East and West and has resumed that traditional role. North of Bremen, the land slopes gently westward to the sea. And out of the town of Husum, you take a boat to go out to the Hallige, the salt islands off the coast. They have won land from the sea here the same way the Dutch have won so much of the Netherlands. The way you do it is to build a dike around a piece of shallow seafloor. You pump out the water after you've created the dike. You plant salt-resistant grasses. And then, after you've got a meadow going, you bring in the cattle and you start a dairy operation. These little communities on the Warfs are very close-knit. In that one, every family has the same name. So the main street is only as wide as it needs to be. They're very self-contained here. Every house has its kitchen garden. It's very peaceful here in the Hallige called Hüge. We're leaving Hüge now and flying southward to Hanover, a major industrial town, a primary target for bombers in World War II. And the town was nearly leveled. So when they came to rebuild the town, they rebuilt it in a style which I can only describe as modern, monstrous. The philosophy here was to make people feel kind of insignificant in these tremendous structures. Yet everyone we spoke to here expressed the urge not to live among these symbols of modernity, but each one to have his own private, one-family house. But Germans are worried these days. They're wondering what's going to happen to the German currency, which now buys lots of luxury goods. But what about the mark in the past? It's had a turbulent history. There's a 20-mark note, that's Baron von Tucher's ancestor on it. And a 100-mark note looks like good money, and it is. And you could buy an overnight in a good hotel with that. And back in 1923, 100 marks looked like good solid currency. You could pay a month's rent in a city apartment with that. But then things began to get a little more difficult, and they had to start printing 1,000-mark notes. Then they had to start printing 10,000-mark notes. Then million-mark notes. Then 10 million-mark notes. Then 50 million-mark notes. Then 50 billion-mark notes. That one wad of currency, if you could redeem that today, would relieve the entire national debt of Germany and the United States. And in its time, you could hardly buy a loaf of bread with it. So Germans are concerned. They're also concerned with the future of Berlin, 90 miles east, inside of Soviet-held East Germany. Oh, you can go to Berlin. We've done it many times. You drive along the Autobahn, you pay the East Germans a toll, and don't get off the Autobahn. You get in trouble if you do. But you can, in about an hour and a half, drive into Berlin, drive right down the Kurfürstendamm and see this glossy city, suggesting prosperity. It's the biggest city in continental Europe with the highest industrial production on the continent. But there are reminders of how this all came about. In the background are the remains of the Memorial Church, the ruins stabilized by sturdy bands of iron to keep the ruins from crumbling even further. But the grimmest reminder of all is just a little further east, the wall beyond which you see the Brandenburg Gate. The wall was built by the East German authorities, and the reason they built it, they said, was to keep revenge seekers and saboteurs from the west from entering the people's paradise to the east. That wall is very real. Anyone from the east who wishes to cross this unauthorized is likely to be gunned down by his own policemen or soldiers. Berlin is a cosmopolitan city. Anyone can get anything they want any hour of the day or night. And the lights are on in West Berlin because of the existence of the Ernst Reuter power plant. When the Soviets drew up their plan for the division of Berlin at the Potsdam Conference, they very carefully included all the working power plants in their part of town. So when the time came for the blockade, which they had obviously premeditated, they simply pulled the switches and the lights went out in West Berlin. West Berlin would have blacked out and stayed blacked out if it hadn't been for the airlift flying in the pieces to complete the huge Ernst Reuter power plant and then the coal to fuel it. Without this, West Berlin would have been lost to the Western world, would no longer be the capital of Germany. It's no longer the political capital as it was in the time of the building of the Charlottenburg Palace when the German Empire was expanding all over the world into southern Africa, into the South Pacific. But Berlin today is still the spiritual and artistic capital of Germany. In the gatehouse opposite the Charlottenburg Palace is the Egyptian collection, featuring the Kalabsha Gate, a gift of the people of Egypt to the people of Germany, who helped with finance and engineering to rebuild the Temple of Abu Simbel, to raise it above the rising waters of Lake Nasser. And here in the Egyptian collection is possibly the loveliest lady in the course of human history, a peerless lady called Nefertiti. And across the street in the Greco-Roman collection is a portrait done from life of Cleopatra. Another lovely lady is the goddess Athena, found by the German archaeologist Schliemann in a Greek excavation. Yes, there are many lovely ladies in Berlin. You find others in the Dahlem collection. Vermeer's Portrait of a Girl with Pearls, one of his few existing masterpieces. Another one I like very much was done by Sandro Botticelli. It's an altar picture, one of the masterpieces of the Dahlem collection, which has what I call museumship. And here they have Rembrandt's finest work, in the opinion of many critics, a portrait of the Mennonite preacher and his wife. This was done at the peak of Rembrandt's powers. The Dahlem collection is only one of 26 museums in West Berlin alone. You could spend a month just doing museums. Not all of Berlin was destroyed by bombing. 10 miles southwest of the center of town is this house in which Bismarck's mother lived for about 10 years. Now it's the home of some friends of ours. They have a teenage daughter who very seldom looks at the inscription over the door because she has a much more important thing to do. She has to talk with her bird. But teenagers seem to be quite the same throughout the Western world. The collection of dolls, and on the bed, the favorite, not a hairy dog, but the universal teddy bear. And of course, the well-worn TV set. Meanwhile, her mother's getting ready for a Kaffeeklatsch, friends coming in for an afternoon of coffee and pastries. But she's not doing strudel. She's doing börek. What's börek? That's a Turkish pastry, because Zinat Edin is one of 160,000 Turkish guest workers in the city of Berlin, making Berlin the fourth largest Turkish city in the world after Istanbul, Ankara, and Smyrna. Zinet came up from the little town of Adapazarı in southern Turkey, hoping to earn enough money to make a down payment to buy a building lot so she and her husband, who worked in the local electrical plant, could have a home. She left her daughter, Aisha, at home. She was desperately homesick, and then she got a job, a responsible job, as a cook in a retirement home. And very shortly they found her talent, and now she's in charge of 16 cooks, most of them German, in the largest retirement home in Berlin. Her husband came up to visit, brought the family, and now he's got a job at Siemens, so they're living the life of a prosperous middle-class German family with all the amenities they've come to take for granted. Yet they still want to maintain their Turkish identity. They're between two worlds, and it's a difficult place for them. There's enough of a Turkish-speaking colony in Berlin, so they have their own Turkish-language radio programs, played on Radio Free Berlin.
Seçme hakkımız olaydı. Herhalde sosyal demokratların yüzüde. Fikret Kuziner söylüyor. Hicran oku sinemdeler.
For many, this is an alien sound, even becoming so to many of the Turks who've been many years in Berlin. They came there as guest workers, to work in the factories, to turn out the goods for which Germans have achieved a worldwide reputation. Here in Stuttgart, lots of Turkish workers work in a plant with a famous signet. 30,000 workers, with 9,000 guest workers from Greece, from Turkey, from Italy, from Yugoslavia, from Morocco, from Spain, turn out the descendants of Gottlieb Daimler's first horseless carriage. Daimler threw away the horse and put a brass motor in the back seat of the carriage. You had to have an engineer to play a flame on the carburetor, but occasionally the thing would explode, so you got yourself another engineer. This was one of the early hazards of motoring. Then along came a real genius, Carl Benz, who built the first purpose-built motor vehicle. It was a beauty. It had a 1-horsepower engine that got 90 miles to the gallon. So this was the ancestor of the tens of millions of cars that have since saturated the world's highways and eventually will use up all the petroleum in the world. Then what are we going to do? We're going to walk? Not if the people at Daimler-Benz have anything to say about it, because here we are riding in the first hydrogen-powered bus. Where do you get hydrogen? You stick electrodes in your dishwater. And at one you get oxygen, the other you get hydrogen. You put this in your car, it runs better than it does on gasoline. So when gas gets to be $5 a gallon, we'll start looking at hydrogen, and it will work, and it won't pollute because the combustion product is water that goes right down the ditch and back to your electrodes again. So this guarantees that the Autobahn will continue to be one of the most terrifying highways in the world with no speed limit. I'd much rather drive on some of the peaceful little roads in the south, like this one that reminds me quite a lot of the roads through the Adirondack area in northeastern New York State where we live. Enjoy the tranquility and the beauty. You'll find also that the people here make their living the same way we make the living in the Adirondacks, milking the cows and milking the tourists. Find yourself a little inn on a side road. Near Ofterschwang, we found the Ferienhaus Mühlbach. It was built as a miller's home, is now operated as a small inn by a hard-working chemist at a nearby tile factory and his even harder-working wife. The room we had here had a beautiful bay window, and the bedding on the bed was civilized, unlike those feather puffs that are like wrestling a hot hippopotamus all night long. There was a terrace out there, and you could look over and listen to the cattle and enjoy the landscape and feel a very special kind of peace. Early in the morning, before sunup, the steaming cattle were coming by, and kids were gathering to take the bus to school. The bus will serve later in the day as a tour coach, and that explains why the driver has a microphone. I suppose he could use that to shout down an insurrection in the back of the bus, but German school children are extremely well disciplined because they know that in Germany you take an examination that determines from that day forward whether you will work with your head or with your hands. And from the verdict of this examination, there is virtually no appeal. So the kids who are going to work with their heads realize the countdown starts immediately. Everything directed now toward that awful examination at the end of high school called the Abitur, upon which your entire intellectual future is determined. If you do well in the Abitur, you get a free university education right up to the doctorate, and this is the Union card of the learned trades. The frosts were just beginning to melt off the grass up by the Meyer house. This is a 100-year-old house. 4 families, all with the name of Meyer, live under that roof, and there's an apartment up under the eaves that's rented out to skiers in the wintertime and visitors in the summertime. These farms really are not economical, but the German government intends that they shall survive. No, they're not economical, but during times of trouble, Germans clearly remember that it was just such uneconomic farms as this that provided the food that enabled many Germans to survive. When the girls come home from school, they're like school kids anywhere, they couldn't possibly do homework alone. So they get together to do their English lesson. Delightful kids, but with the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads, that awful examination called the Abitur at the end of their school career. German tax authorities are convinced that if a German farmer cannot make $15,000 clear in a year, he can't be very bright. And therefore he's probably so stupid he can't even fill out a tax form. Poor Effie, she has a father who's so dumb he can't possibly earn $15,000 a year. He only earns $14,995. The Meyers are very careful about money. Lunch is the principal meal of the day in a hill country farm, so the evening meal is more in the order of a snack, but it's a substantial one. This is a conservative family. They live surrounded by the souvenirs of a long occupation of this sturdy farmhouse in the Allgäu Mountains. And if you go to Germany, and especially if you travel in the hills and you don't hear the sound of an Alp horn, you may feel a little disappointed. Herr Meyer is a member of a group that plays the Alp horn. So for us, he brought out that splendid piece of plumbing. He got into a traditional costume. He found a completely appropriate background and treated us to some of the music made by the Alp horn.
And now, a preview of 2 other fine Travelogue video presentations. Would you like to be an American in Paris? Have a closer look at this great city as traveloguer Clay Francisco captures the flavor of Parisian hospitality lavished on Americans in Paris throughout history. In Austrian Odyssey, you'll be treated to magnificent countryside and thoughtful insights into the lives and culture of this quiet people. Come along with traveloguer Frank Nichols as he explores the peaceful lifestyles of beautiful Austria. The Travelogue collection is constantly adding new destinations to its entertaining and educational series. For more information about how you and your family can benefit from seeing the world through the eyes of a traveloguer, please contact your local dealer. To locate a dealer in your area, call toll-free 1-800-521-5104. As a result of your enjoyment of this Travelogue video presentation, you may also enjoy a live Travelogue film presentation and the opportunity to meet these adventurers personally. Once again, call our toll-free number and we'll direct you to a live show in your area.